Good afternoon to everyone. It is 12:30 on the clock at ako ang inyong nag-iisang boss sa balat ng radyo. My name is Miguel Yamamoto, or as everyone calls me, Yama. And I'll be your podcast host for today. This is Atenista Speaks, your number one noontime podcast of the Ateneo de Manila University. And today, in our very special episode, we will be talking about quite a spicy topic, and that is cultural appropriation. So, without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our guests for today, my fellow Atenistas, Gian Largo, Shaq Babilonia, Phil Condat, and Ester Signo. So, I'd like to welcome you guys. Thank you for being here today.
Hello, hello.
Oh,
Good to be here.
Hi, sir.
All right. So before we begin this discussion, we'll be answering the main question. On what grounds can you appropriate the culture of others? So as we discuss our podcast today, keep in mind that main question, okay? So as we begin, we need to first define what exactly this is. So what is cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation, also called cultural misappropriation, occurs when a person from one culture adopts the fashion, iconography, trends, or styles from another culture. Some of the most controversial and harmful examples of cultural appropriation happen when the culture being appropriated is one of a historically oppressed group. All right. I think to be more precise, we can start off by asking, where do you draw the line between cultural appropriation and appreciation?
All right. So, first of all, thank you, Yama, for that wonderful and energetic introduction. Let's first define what cultural appreciation is. Cultural appreciation can be defined as the act of understanding and learning about other cultures in an effort to broaden perspectives and connect with others cross-culturally. However, on the other hand, cultural appropriation is taking one aspect of culture and using it for personal interest. Some might actually say that there's really no such thing as cultural appropriation because no culture is completely original or an influence. While others also believe that musicians, designers, and artists that try to create art for the public to consume get a pass because they are creating art that is open to discussion and interpretation.
All right, so thank you for defining those two terms. Again, to repeat, that was cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. As we proceed with the case studies, we need to take into account these two terms. This is very important because we'll be going back and forth with these two ends of the spectrum. And it's really important that we've defined this in order to get a grasp on determining what exactly is appropriation and appreciation. So, I want to ask you guys on now that you've mentioned culture, and since it's equally important to discuss its value, I want to ask you guys that. How is a culture's value being used?
so one case study about the Dream Weavers, which is documentary, the use of Tenalak, in which culture is being used as well known in the tribe, being devalued as time goes by. Tenalak is made of weaved abaca fibers in which designs are usually dreamed by the weavers. Used are from the plants cooked in hot pot to extract color and is all handmade that usually takes time to make. The value of the nalak was equivalent to a house, used for a gift for marriage, and usually a trade for an animal. The value diminished due to capitalism, in which the new processed way of making a traditional cloth was made by using sewing machines, and designs were not dreams but just merely copies. And lastly, sold in the market for other uses. According to the weavers, Tenalak is being rushed, and the respect to make it is also gone, where it has to be sold or else they no longer survive without any getting sales.
All right. So, actually, there's also a similar case study that I would like to relate to this. It's just an example. I just want to share on how culture's value is being used. And this was when Christian Louboutin tried to partner with Angie Ilul and the group of great women for a production of product called Manila Kaba. They are trying to create a line of bags, limited edition, wherein they feature the work of Yakan tribes. And the disappointing thing about this is how Angie tried to claim that she's part of the Yakan tribe when she's not really part of it, knowing that there's a significant value on the products that Yakan weavers do.
So about capitalism, um, it is usually selling something at a higher price, which is For example, in Tivoli Drive, they usually sell it for the very cheap price, and then they sell it to the market abroad for like double or triple the price. Which is why some foreigners or investors invest in the Philippines because everything's cheaper.
I agree. And in both cases and examples that were mentioned, I think it's very evident how a culture's value or significance are being exploited and are used to make profit.
All right, so you guys mentioned some really deep words here, especially capitalism and exploitation. Because I asked the question, how is the culture's value being used? And so we interpret value, therefore, as that of being subjected to capitalism, the monetary value of this. And I guess that is correct when you say, when you involve cultural appropriation to exploiting or taking advantage of culture to earn money, right? By selling. But that also makes me wonder. I guess a question to ponder on is, what exactly is culture then? Is it is it the ones within or creating the culture? In this case, the weavers, or is it the culture itself or the items representing the culture? In this case, would be the textiles, the ones that they weaved, right? Do you guys have any ideas on any insights on that?
In both cases here, I believe that culture is seen in both the weavers and the items that they make. Because what culture is the values, the beliefs, all of that in a group. And then it is present in both in the people, and then they embody it in the items that they do.
All right. Okay, thank you. I guess we could end there. Next question is, I actually want to ask, this time involving history, because we talked about value. Let's talk about history. How do historical backgrounds, cultural practices, and locations, and other aspects, all of these aspects of culture, affect cultural appropriation itself?
So for our next case, we will be focusing on history, and then in this particular case study, we will be looking at how white people start to wear cornrows, dreadlocks, and other known black hairstyles. So, for a quick background on the history of the US, how the blacks were treated for the past centuries is that they were treated as slaves coming from Africa, shipped into the US. So for a couple of centuries, they were treated as they were oppressed by the whites, and then this is one of the reasons why there has been a backlash every time there is a famous celebrity that wears cornrows or dreadlocks. And then another reason why there's a negative reaction from the black people is because there is still systemic racism found in the country, that it is still easier for whites to get jobs, to get education, to get loans. It is still prevalent even though slavery is not anymore. So why does this frustrate black people? It's because it only makes the hairstyles a trend. It doesn't really necessarily make the whites accept the culture, but it only accepts the cool parts of the culture. In this case, the hairstyles.
So you talked about wearing black hairstyles in the US. What's the context naman here sa Philippines?
So Philippines, I think it's not really much of an issue because there's no historical background between the two cultures, and I think that uh, as us as a race, like we don't really get bothered by the hairstyle, or we don't really know the culture behind the hairstyles.
All right, okay, I see. But does awareness excuse you from cultural appropriation? Does a lack of knowledge on the history deem you as someone appropriating a culture?
Okay. So for me, ignorance about the history of one culture is unacceptable because one should really study, understand, absorb what the culture represents before he or she tries to represent it him or herself.
I understand. However, there's also I feel like sometimes we also have limitations on what we can study, what we can learn, what we can access on different learning platforms. And the important thing is when you're trying to represent a culture and you insist on wanting to represent a culture, you just need to make the sufficient amount of research. And whenever there's someone who can acknowledge or who can raise a criticism, whether or not you don't know, you have a lack of information, then might as well just be open to constructive criticism, try to empathize on what they're trying to say, and apply this on what you're trying to practice.
All right. With those points being raised, I'd like to ask, so is it better to just completely avoid engaging in the culture with the risk of appropriating it, or engage in it, being well informed about the history, but with the risk of still being incorrect or refusing to acknowledge the history?
Again, as what I've said earlier, you just have to be open to criticisms that might arise when you try to practice these kinds of cultures. Like, and we can say in this example, trying to do the black hairstyles, and I just feel like you just have to be more open into learning, but at the same time, do your research because it's also your responsibility.
I personally disagree. You should. It is much better if you step out and not do the culture itself. If you're not in part of that society, because somehow, yeah, it's being disrespectful for, especially for the people in that community.
I agree with Esther on this because it's way better to not offend anyone than try try absorbing their culture, trying to represent their culture, and then unknowingly offend them. I guess the risk is way less than not trying to represent the culture at all.
All right. So, ito na, nagkakaroon na tayo ng medyo opposing ideologies, and we're starting to have a lot of substantial opposing ideas. But what I guess the takeaway here is that when it comes to cultural appropriation, we're really treading on some very thin line between separating what's offensive and what's politically correct. As opposed to our previous case study, which focused more on the value, the capitalism of cultures. This one where it's more sensitive because we're talking about the possible oppression of marginalized groups, right? And so I think the key word to remember here when it comes to cultural appropriation is the word sensitivity. And later on we'll actually transition to our next and last case study, which will further talk about and go around this idea of this sensitivity, right? So I want to ask you guys naman this time around, lastly, is how does the person's identity determine whether or not an action is deemed cultural appropriation? So yung tanong ko dito is, since we're talking about cultures and within cultures itself are people practicing that culture, what's the value of the people doing that culture? How does their identity determine whether or not what they're doing is cultural appropriation? So for this last case study, we'll actually make use of MMK and their use of blackface in multiple episodes in Filipino showbiz and TV shows, okay? So for the pasakalaman na lahat, ang MMK, it's a weekly primetime show that has been running since 1991, and there's episodes are based on actual real life Filipino stories. And one of the episodes, celebrity Maymay Entrata plays Manap, a member of an indigenous Aita community, and she actually won a village beauty pageant. So the facts for this is that a lot of people have been calling out MMK for their portrayal of blackfacing in this MMK episode about Aita communities, as well as how several roles of characters were portrayed by light-skinned celebrities. One netizen actually tweeted, she sent me this tweet, "This is blackface, appropriating the local Aita community. Local artists, especially as role models to young and impressionable fans, should know better," Jessica Nicole said. On a similar episode, Equal Rights, which featured about the Aita UP graduate, Norman King, was also called out for using blackface in the same episode. The in the same show, they in the same episode they actually hired Shong Hilario, Zaijan Zaranilla, and Nicky Valdez, all of which were already popular mainstream light-skinned artists, to play roles for this episode. So, what are your insights on blackfacing?
I think in this case, the MMK should be the ones who should reach out to the communities that they are trying to portray, and they should ask how they should portray them accurately, and then if there's any problem with how with the way that they do things.
Yes, I partially agree with Shaq. However, there's there's a lot of opportunities that these producers like MMK could grab. Like for example, there are a lot of artists, uh, fair skinned or different talents that we can find just here in the Philippines that could accurately depict more of a an ITA community, or we could they could do this to avoid blackfacing.
I think here in the MMK episodes, it's up to the producers to really go to the communities that they are trying to represent in order to not misrepresent anything or ask how they do if they want to do things.
I partially agree with what Shaq is trying to say. However, there's a lot of different opportunities that these producers, directors can grab regarding the talent, since I think there's a wide range of choices because there are many talented people that can be uh, used as or that can be hired as actors and actresses to more accurately depict what culture they are trying to represent.
I highly agree. Since the actors are more unique and talented in that community, it will showcase their culture more and it will have more substance.
Yes, and I believe it will be really problematic is when even if maraming talent available that can accurately represent the culture, if they choose not to, it will make it seem like they only want to cast a famous person.
Yes, the best thing to do here is to hire pure Filipinos. At That's the best thing to do for me because it's the best way to represent our own culture, society.
I also think
Uh,
it's much better if the directors and the producers study it in depth to make sure that they're doing the representations correctly.
all right, so I want to go back to what Phil said about hiring pure Filipino actors and actresses. Because as I heard this, I can't help but question what do we really mean by pure Filipino actors and actresses? Since the Philippines is a society or a place with a wide range of cultures and definition of what being a Filipino is. There's a diversity in the cultures that are being represented here in the country. Since, first of all, looking back at our history, we were colonized by different nations. And through this, there's an evolution as to how we understand what being a pure Filipino is. At the same time, different subjective opinions and subjective definitions of what being a pure Filipino is can also be found relatively to what kind of experiences and geographical locations these Filipino citizens interact with.
All right, so that was substantially a lot of information for our last case study. And I think we can end on that note. Let's get a recap on all the things that we've discussed so far. So, um, to summarize everything, there were a lot of very insightful opinions, especially some very important terms that we're continuously repeating across our discussions. And I like to bring this up again. We've talked about first the definitions of culture, appreciation, and cultural appropriation. We talked about the dynamics, the spectrum, very unique situations where it can be deemed as appropriation and it can be deemed as appreciation. And the practice of engaging with culture itself is very important. Another term is understanding the words sensitivity, the words value, and under that exploitation and capitalism, all of which are very important words to be aware of when it comes to discussing cultural appropriation. And of course, as we end, we need to look at culture itself as a whole, truly valuing culture, not just the monetary value, truly engaging, preserving, and practicing a culture for the sake, not only for aesthetics, for personal gain, not for style or fashion, but for the sake of culture itself. And I think that is what cultural appreciation means. And I guess that's it. With all that being said, I like to thank everyone for being here today. You everyone, all of you really offered a lot of insightful information, your own opinions. Thank you for that. I mean, the whole point of this podcast today was really to just have an open discussion on such a sensitive topic, really. And to give our dear listeners a chance to be aware of cultural appropriation if they are not, or to have more ideas on what exactly the problem is. So with that, no, very thank you very much again. This is Gian Largo, Shaq Babilonia, Ester Signo, and Phil Condat, our fellow Atenistas, tuning in today at the Ateneo Speaks. Okay, thank you everyone.
Thank you, Boss ng
Thank
Bayan.
you.
Thank you, Boss Bayan.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you guys for tuning in. You can follow me on Instagram at LargoGN, and you can also add me on Facebook if you want to know more about our topic.
Yes,
At Gian
okay.
Largo.
Appreciate, do not appropriate.
Yes, correct.
Thanks.
All right. Ateneo Speaks.